All right. Well, thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be going to Exodus chapter 8. Continuing our series through the book of Exodus, this is message number 10 in that series entitled Other Nation. We're going to be looking at chapter 8 with verses 1 and 2. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. So, chapter 7 began the series of plagues, judgments, wonders, signs, the striking of Egypt by God. And really, that runs through the next several chapters that ultimately leads to the exodus from Egypt. And one of the signs that Moses and Aaron were given to perform before Israel was pouring out water from the Nile on the ground and it turning to blood. And here in chapter 7, that sign became a wonder in judgment that extended to all the fresh water of Egypt. But the plague itself seemed to have very little effect on Pharaoh. Um, it did have some effect on the Egyptians as we saw them trying to dig wells, trying to find other alternative water sources. But it seemed to have very little effect on Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's sorcerers were able to reproduce it on a small scale. And he was satisfied with that. And we're told that he hardened his heart, meaning that he wouldn't listen to the commands from God that he let Israel go. So now we come to chapter 8. And the plagues continue here. In fact, we get the second, third, and fourth of the plagues here as they sort of begin coming in quick succession. And the plagues, we see that they follow a certain pattern, and that was established right there in chapter 7 with the first one. There's a certain repetition to the plagues, to the accounts that we are given. And there's certainly the development and the reinforcement of some very important themes in the book of Exodus. So as we read through these and we pay attention to Pharaoh, we can see that aspect of hardening, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, meaning that he stubbornly refused to hear and to obey the words of the Lord that were sent to him through Moses and Aaron. We also see with Pharaoh a number of false promises, and that didn't begin with the first one, but it does begin here in chapter number 8, where he at least promises to relent, but ultimately goes back on that. And then also we see a repetition of Pharaoh asking for there to be prayer to the Lord that the plague would be removed. As we read through these plagues, and then we think about certain repetition concerning God that we see in these plagues, and we see him giving a warning. So there's a word that is sent to Pharaoh, and a part of that is a warning. If you refuse these commands, then these things are going to happen. And of course, that also would be a repetition of the commands. God says, let my people go. There's also the predicting, the foretelling, as God explains that he will not let the people go and this plague will be brought upon them. And then also the reference to hardening, because sometimes we have a reference to God hardening the heart of Pharaoh. We also see a repetition of the explanation for these plagues being that Egypt and that Pharaoh will know that Yahweh is Lord, he is God. And then we also can think about certain repetition concerning Israel. Now, as we read through this, we see that Israel is sort of passive. They are brought up, let Israel go, I will not let Israel go, that sort of thing. But also we get this repetition of God referring to Israel as my people, using that singular for nation and with the possessive. They are his nation, he repeatedly says throughout these plagues. So even though there is a repetition in the patterns of these plagues and the development of these themes, that doesn't mean that these are just simply repeating the same exact thing. What you'll notice about the plagues as we go through them is that they tend to build up. They start out relatively low, and they're sort of escalating as they go. And obviously, there's a buildup in these plagues up to that final plague, the death of the firstborn. But also, as we go, we will start to see expansion as other elements are introduced and added from one plague to the next. So we want to look at this chapter, and of course, it has three primary parts to it, verses 1 to 15, which give us the second plague, verses 16 to 19, the third plague, and verses 20 to 32, the fourth plague. So we will start here with the second plague. Let's begin with verses 1 to 4. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. If thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. And the frogs shall come up both on thee, and upon thy people, and upon all thy servants. So one of the themes of Exodus as a book, as a whole, is that of Israel becoming a nation. And we talked about that somewhat in the earlier parts of this book, and the promises that God had made to Abraham that they would go into this strange land, but there they would become a great and mighty nation, and that he would bring them out. So we have one of the themes is, again, Israel becoming a nation, but not just any nation. Israel is becoming a nation. They're growing and by this point have grown into a mighty nation while they have been in Egypt, but not just one of the nations to add to the table that we have in Genesis chapter 10, for instance. No, this is the nation that God promised to Abraham. And he first identified them as my people, my nation, back in chapter 3 and verse number 7. And we see that language used here again. Let my people, my nation, that that singular that is used there, let my nation go. And this occurs 6 times here in chapter number 8, and around 40 times in the book as a whole, God referring to Israel as my nation. And so as we go from Genesis to Exodus, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then we have the family of Jacob, and then the tribes of Jacob, and growing into the nation, my people, my nation, that God says here in the book of Exodus. And of course, this very fact reinforces one of the reasons for these plagues and these judgments on Egypt, and that's to deliver Israel. That is to ransom, redeem Israel, God's chosen nation, to bring them back to the land because of his promises to the fathers. Now, that was emphasized a lot in the earlier part of the book of Exodus as we looked at, as we start getting into these plagues and this interaction with Pharaoh and all these things with Egypt. It's not emphasized as much, but it is still there. We should know that as we go into reading this, that is always underlying these actions, that God swore by his name to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob that he would turn this people into a mighty nation and he would bring them back to the land. So when we see that reference to let my people go, let my nation go, then we should bring with that all of those promises that God gave, beginning with Abraham, and the foundation of why God is acting. Now, of course, we see here again God giving the command, giving the warning, and predicting, in fact, what is going to happen. Now, this plague is explained as being an overspreading of the land of Egypt with frogs. They're going to be in the houses, in the containers. They're going to be in the food. They're going to be on the people and in their beds and all of these sort of things. And it's going to afflict from the highest to the lowest, from the slaves all the way up to Pharaoh himself and those in his household. Let's look at verses 5 to 7. And the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch forth thine hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt. So here again we have the command given to Moses, and Moses is to command Aaron. Aaron is to stretch out his staff over the waters, and as he does so, these frogs come up in a great abundance to cover the land of Egypt. Now we also read here about how the sorcerers of Pharaoh were able to imitate this. But once again, notice they can't undo it. They can't undo what Moses and Aaron have done. Their frogs don't come up and swallow up the frogs that Moses and Aaron called up. They can't rid the land of the frogs, but they were able to bring some more in. Verses 8 to 11. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice unto the Lord. And Moses said unto Pharaoh, glory over me. When shall I entreat for thee and for thy servants and for thy people to destroy the frogs from thee and thy houses, that they may remain in the river only? And he said, tomorrow. And he said, be it according to thy word, that thou mayest know that there is none like unto the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from thee and from thy houses and from thy servants and from thy people, and they shall remain in the river only. So even though the magicians did their part, we do see a different reaction from Pharaoh at this point than what we have seen. So the magicians were able to bring up some frogs, but Pharaoh here asks Moses and Aaron essentially to pray to the Lord that the frogs would be taken away. So this is a new development. As I said, these plagues, they sort of build up and they sort of increase as we get toward the end. So here's a new happening. And Pharaoh also gives a promise that he would let them go. Now, Moses speaks to Pharaoh here, and this phrasing is a little odd, glory over me, when shall I entreat for thee? Essentially, what Moses asks here is essentially like saying, you name the time. You name the time when this is going to happen. So in other words, it's not that Moses just has foresight to know when the frogs are going to leave, but he says, you name the time. And that's when it will happen. And of course, it is done, as we are told, so that he will know there is none like the Lord our God. Yes, the magicians may be able, through their demonic powers, to call up some frogs, but there's none like the Lord our God. So he has him name the time. Let's look at verses 12 to 15. Excuse me. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses and out of the villages and out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart and hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. So Moses did indeed pray, and the Lord removed the frogs by Moses' words. In other words, they had Pharaoh to name the time, so to speak, and so it was done that way. But Pharaoh responded not to the magicians this time, but he responded to the relief from the plague. When there was a relief, when the frogs had died and they were able to gather them up and to dispose of them, he responded, and he responded by hardening his heart and also by going back on his promise. So in other words, he sort of steeled himself in his stubborn refusal to obey the words of God and just completely went back on what he had promised to do. But again, we have that emphasis there at the end of verse 15 that this was just as God had said. And obviously, God is not finished with his purpose and his plan in Egypt. The next plague is the third plague that begins here. Let's look at verses 16 and 17. And the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast, and all the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Now, the word for lice that is used here isn't quite that specific as what we think of as lice. And so it's not entirely clear what this was. Some of the newer translations, I believe, actually have this as gnats. What we do know is that they were very, very small and stinging or biting type of insects that seem to like cling on to people and cling on to the animals and such. And so they covered the land of Egypt, and they're afflicting all of the people, and they're afflicting all of the animals, and certainly a sore trial that they were. And of course, we get that emphasis at the end of verse 17 that all of the land of Egypt was afflictive. In other words, this wasn't just in one spot, but all across the land of this nation. Verses 18 to 19. And the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice upon man and upon beasts. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. So once again, we see this familiar pattern. The sorcerers of Egypt have tried to reproduce this wonder. But this time, they're unable to do so. Now, we're not told why. And really, when you think about it, if they were able to do the things that they did before now, why would they not be able to do this? I mean, what would be so special about this that they wouldn't be able to reproduce this? And certainly they thought they could, because they went with their usual means, their usual enchantments to do this, but they could not do it. Well, no mention is made of why. And actually, as you proceed on from here, these sorcerers they drop out. We don't read of them trying to reproduce these effects anymore. So we are essentially left to discern, why could they not do this? And what we can say for certain is that they could not, meaning God didn't permit it. Now, did they have the power? Well, they had power before. Again, this demonic power that was working through them. They were able to do these other things that they did. I don't really understand or see any reason why they wouldn't be able to do this just like they had before. And the way that the account is written, it leads us to expect that's what's going to happen, but it says they couldn't. As if they tried, but they couldn't. And then the only explanation really that we know for certain is that God didn't permit it. He overcame them. Just like the snake swallowing the other snakes when Aaron put down his staff and the magicians put down their staffs. And again, if you think about all of the things that they did up to this point, they could never undo or overcome what Moses and Aaron had done. They could only sort of imitate it. And now that is put to an end. That is put to a stop. They're not permitted to even do that anymore. Why? Because God is the greatest power. He is the power over all powers. He is the sovereign, supreme Lord. Just as was spoken earlier, Moses said, "You will know that there is none like our God." Well, and also you notice that it brought a confession on the part of the magicians. This is the finger of God. Now, This is the work of God. In other words, this is God's doing. They're talking about the God of Israel. And so now the failure of the magicians is enough for Pharaoh to be hardened. And he would not obey the repeated commands to let Israel go. And of course, once again, verse 19 ends with the emphasis this is according to what the Lord had said already before he had made this known. So then we move to the fourth plague, verses 20 to 21. And the Lord said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. So the pattern continues. The Lord speaks again to Moses. And it gets to a point where, especially the more familiar that you are with this account, and as you're reading through here, it just sort of almost becomes commonplace that God is speaking to Moses. And we're not given the description every single time that it takes place, but like is made clear in the book of Deuteronomy, he spoke to Moses face to face. He came down. He met him there at the burning bush on the mountain, and he's speaking to Moses face to face as a man talks to his friend. That's what it was said about this relationship and the nature of the revelation that Moses received. So it's easy for us to overlook how unique this is. And the frequency with which God is just directly conversing with Moses. But he does come and he renews this command to let Israel go and gives this warning of this plague of the swarms of flies. Verses 22 to 24. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And the Lord did so. And there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses and into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. Well, here again, we get another new development. Now we see God says, not only is he going to send this plague, but he is going to separate the people of Israel in the land of Goshen within Egypt from the Egyptians in suffering the effects of this plague. And this is serving as a further sign of the Lord to Pharaoh. A sign of what? That he is the Lord of all the earth. He's not just the God of Israel. He's the Lord of all the earth. And now he's going to afflict the nation of Egypt, and he's going to make a distinction. And he's going to separate his people, and he's going to protect them and preserve them from suffering the effects of this plague. And then we read of how that God did just as he said that he would do. Now we look at verses 25 to 28. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, Go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moses said, It's not meet so to do, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, and will they not stone us? We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he shall command us. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only ye shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. So as Pharaoh partially relents here, and he says that he will let the people go and sacrifice, but not leave the land of Egypt. And of course, Moses then explains why they must leave the land of Egypt And so Pharaoh gives this restriction. Well, okay, but not very far. Not 3 days journey, obviously, would be the intent. Not very far. And he again asks for them to pray to God for him for the plague to be removed. And in the end of the chapter, verses 29 to 32, and Moses said, Behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully anymore in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and he removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. There remained not one. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. So you notice how that Moses agrees to pray to the Lord for Pharaoh and for this plague to be removed, but he warns Pharaoh concerning his previous false promise. Don't be certain that you don't do this again. In other words, this is already against him. And Moses prayed, and once again God answers Moses. And once again, once there was relief from the plague, we're told that Pharaoh hardened his heart. He stiffened his neck. He doubled down, as it were, on his refusal to obey, and he would not let them go like he said that he would. So the plagues in this account, as we've seen a good example now going from chapter 7 through chapter 8, and how they're building up from the beginning, how there's a repetition. There certainly is a pattern there. There's certainly something to be said for the themes that are developed and reinforced. But they're also building up as we move along. There are new developments as we go, and new things that happen, which give us more and more information and insight. They lead all the way to that 10th plague, like I mentioned in the beginning. But something else that we also see Moses growing in boldness. We don't read here anything of his hesitancy. We don't read anything of his raising of objections based on his own limitations and failures. And we even get a sight here of Moses rebuking Pharaoh for his false promises. And we also see Israel once again as passive. But beginning with this 4th plague, we see how that they receive mercy from God as he separates them from Egypt in experiencing the plague. Now, this is not something that they earned. This is not something they deserved or merited in any way. But God is making a difference between them and Egypt because they are his people. Again, receiving mercy from the Lord. Now, as you read the Bible and you go from the beginning, and as you're starting in Genesis and you're coming through Exodus, realize that you're building up what might be called the book of faith. You're building up all of those different blocks that go together really to build a strong faith and understanding of the Lord as he is revealed in his word. So the events here are referred to in later places of the Bible, later in the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. And they're referred to as being foundational to faith and understanding of who God is. They're a very important part of who Israel is, but who Israel is only matters or makes sense in understanding who God is and the promises that he has made. And so if we think about Paul referring to these events in the book of Exodus, and particularly this between Moses and Pharaoh, Paul refers to these events in Romans chapter 9 as illustrating God's sovereign choice of vessels and fulfilling his purpose according to his own will. And it's maybe easy for us to read through and to think, well, God chose Israel. That was his chosen nation. So God chose Israel. And then God chose Moses. That was the chosen leader of the people of Israel. But maybe we don't think about the fact that God also chose Pharaoh. And that is exactly what Paul talks about here in Romans chapter 9, verses 15 to 24. Paul writing says, "For he saith to Moses," and this is verse 14 right before this, is where Paul raises the objection of saying that it's unfair for God to choose like he chose between Jacob and Esau, that's unfair, that's unrighteous. Well, this is Paul's answer to that. He says, "For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy." In other words, what makes the difference between these vessels? It's not anything in the vessels, he says, but it's in God that shows mercy. "For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh," and we're going to get to this as we go further in Exodus. "For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up." Now, historically, there's a number of different ideas about the exact identity of this Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, and it's not easy to pin down with complete certainty of which man that this was that was serving as the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt at this time. But whoever that it was, God says, "I have raised you up." God chose Pharaoh, put him on this throne over Egypt, and did so for what reason? He says, "For this purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth." So Paul refers back to these events, and then he concludes this way: "Therefore hath he," being God, "mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will, he hardeneth. Thou wilt say unto me, Why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he had afore prepared unto glory, even us whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles or of the nations." So again, as we read this account in Exodus, we're reading the source material from which the later authors of Scripture drew to teach us about God, to explain who God is, to explain why God does what he does, and why God is just in doing what he does. And that, of course, was a major part of Paul's point there in Romans chapter 9. So again, God chose Israel, and that is very plain as we come through this chapter. He says, "My people," and I'm going to make a difference between my people and your people, he says to Pharaoh. "I'm going to make a difference between my nation and your nation, so that you will know that I am God over all the earth and over all the nations of the earth." And God chose Moses as his leader to go in and to speak, and he's holding Pharaoh to account for every word that Moses spoke to him through Aaron, because he spoke with that authority of the revelation of God. But he also chose Pharaoh. He also chose him to be there, to be on that throne, and to be hardened against the word of the Lord, that he might show his power and make himself known even to the vessels of mercy. So again, as we read this account, we are reading that source material, the very building blocks of the faith, as it were. And so we don't want to read over it and it just sort of become commonplace to us, but we want to understand what lessons are here for us. Exodus is in some ways like the book of Job. In the book of Job, we get to see some behind the scenes sort of scenes. We see Satan and appearing before God and speaking and God, and we understand what is happening to Job and why, but Job doesn't understand it. And his friends certainly don't understand it. And we see their conversation taking place, but we see some of that behind the scenes. Well, Exodus is sort of like that we see some of the behind the scenes work so that we can understand what God is doing and why, and that he is the sovereign over the universe. So we get that information here in Exodus. And the point of these revelations, as continually is made known in this book, is to know God. It's to understand who he is, whether we see it or not. Like, we don't see these signs. Well, majority of history didn't see these kinds of signs and wonders. They were only at specific strategic times in redemptive history that God has done this sort of outward manifestation of work. But whether we see it or not, we know who God is, we know who the author of history is, and that all things are working according to his will. All right, that's all of our message. We will close with a hymn.